this insight, social, cultural, and certainly financial, you might think that it's incredibly complex. But in fact, in its basic form, it's pretty simple.
His insight started with the notion that the web was running a continual popularity contest on its own content, and that the number of times a given web page was linked to by other sites might be a measure of how useful or how relevant it was.
Page believed that a link from one website to another is a kind of recommendation, and he and Brin built Google's infant search engine around that conviction. As they put it in a now famous academic paper in 1998, quote, "In essence, Google interprets a link from page A to page B as a vote by page A for page B. Google assesses a page's importance by the votes it receives," end quote. In other words, when a site about, say, Abraham Lincoln has been linked to 15 million times, that means that an awful lot of people have found it useful. Another Lincoln site that's been linked to, say, 11 times has impressed almost no one. Realizing this led Page and Brin to their very own version of the dictate, follow the money. In order to find the most relevant sites, what you had to do was count the links.
Larry's insight about link counting was simple but kind of brilliant, and it would eventually be the core of Google's incredible success. But did Larry understand this at the time? Not a chance.
The first person ever to see Google in action was one of the boys' computer science professors, Hector Garcia Molina.
We played around in my office for a while looking at the in-link counts, as they're called, how many pages point to your page, of interesting pages. So we looked at the Stanford homepage, and then we compared it with other departments, maybe MIT or Berkeley, who are our competitors, and we had lots of fun seeing which of these pages was more important than the others because it was referenced more highly.
When Larry and Sergey launched Google onto the Stanford website, everyone who saw it realized it was something special. Here was a search engine that cared about search again.
From their grad student office on the Stanford campus, shown here in this never-before-seen footage, Page and Brin struggled to manage the runaway popularity of their wondrous innovation.
There was so much traffic to Google that it nearly brought the entire Stanford University internet to its knees. And so the university administration said, you must move off campus.
Stanford had outlived its usefulness to Larry and Sergey. It was time for them to head off campus and into Silicon Valley proper, to look for some cash, to turn their bright idea into an honest-to-goodness company. In doing so, they'd be joining thousands of would-be entrepreneurs seeking fame and fortune in the dot-com era Silicon Valley, which meant that the odds were clearly stacked against them.
Today we look at Google with its stock market value of more than $200 billion, its vast campus in Silicon Valley, and its culture-shifting influence, and we assume that there must have been investors banging down the door, especially at the height of the dot-com bubble, when some of the dumbest ideas imaginable were being showered with cash. But at the time, the reaction among the money men to Google wasn't, hey, no brainer. Instead, it was, oy vey, not another search engine.
One of the few early dissenting voices to this chorus of doubt was that of Vinod Khosla, a hugely successful venture capitalist, tech guru, and one of the co-founders of Sun Microsystems.
I met them, I loved them, said I'd love to work with them in some way. So I introduced them to Excite and said, this is a wonderful search engine and a better approach.
To Khosla, the logic was simple. At the time, he was an investor in the search company Excite, and he figured that if Excite bought or licensed Google's search technology, it would give them an advantage against their bitter rival Yahoo, which seemed to be dominating every battle and vanquishing all of its opponents in the portal wars. If Excite wasn't going to be crushed by Yang and Philo's army, it would need some fresh artillery.
As any military commander will tell you, the key to winning a war is striking the right alliances. Now, in the hopes of getting Excite to team up with Google, Khosla arranged a meeting for Excite's chief technologist, Graham Spencer, to meet with Larry and Sergey at this sushi restaurant. The Google boys arrived with high hopes of securing a lifeline for their project. They'd done a test to demonstrate how much better their search results were than Excite's. Now, firing up their laptops, they showed the results to Spencer. Spencer went back and told Excite's CEO, George Bell, about Google's technology, and so did Khosla.
And there was a lot of resistance. And they'd always come back with a fairly rigid view that search was generic, we can do this, we are almost as good, it doesn't matter. And it wasn't the issue of price, because Google was very cheap then. They could have bought it for something like $1 million. It's worth $100 billion today.
Wait, let's rerun this. Excite could have bought Google for about $1 million? That's a pittance in Silicon Valley terms. The company had just walked away from what for them would have been the deal of a lifetime.
And sure, in hindsight, you know, I'll put my hand up and say I look dumb. But people didn't think you could make money from search, or people thought you could make some money from search. They certainly didn't think it was a mint. I mean, look, let's be honest, search is a mint. It's a mint.
But it wasn't just Excite that failed to see Google's full potential. Every search company in Silicon Valley turned them down flat.
So with increasing frustration, Larry and Sergey sought out a professor of theirs from Stanford who happened also to be a serial entrepreneur, a man named David Sheridan.
They were after, I think, a fairly modest amount of money in the sort of $1 million range. And I had made some money with this startup that had been bought by Cisco, and I was working with Andy Bechtolsheim, who is a well-known Silicon Valley investor.
So David called me up and told me I really had to meet these Google guys, and I drove up to his house. It was a beautiful, summer, sunny morning.
Larry and Sergey were desperate now. If David Sheridan and Andy Bechtolsheim didn't see the potential of Google, it was probably time for the Google boys to get back to those PhDs.
Larry showed up first, and then Sergey showed up, and Andy roared up in his Porsche.
When I arrived at David's house, Larry and Sergey were already there, so they jumped right into giving me a demonstration.
We met this guy. He quickly, he took a quick look at our search engine. We chatted with him a little bit.
They ran him through a demo of here's Google, and we can type in this, and I'm feeling lucky, and all those sorts of elements.
And it was immediately clear that this was a very, very good idea.
I think Andy was sold very quickly on this.
In fact, I think this was the best idea I've seen in my entire life.
So he said, I don't want you guys to have to, take too low a valuation or to have to worry too much about these money things right now. Why don't I just write you a check?
So I rushed out to my car, pulled out my checkbook, and wrote them a check on the spot.
Came back with his checkbook, and he wrote us a check for $100,000.
To Google for $100,000, a bank account, and Andy saying, well, put it in there when you do.
I don't think I've ever written a check on the spot like this before. This was the only time in my life.
Let's think about this. How many people do you know who'd be willing to write a $100,000 check on the spot to a couple of mangy grad students? I mean, even for a guy like Andy Bechtolsheim, who is worth many millions of dollars, the whole thing seems slightly nuts. But that's the kind of thing that happens here in Silicon Valley. It's why they call the early investors angels. They're in the business of doling out little miracles.
Andy was clearly putting a lot of faith in them, not just to not go to Mexico with his money, but they left with an extra level of excitement, as I recall, that we can really do this.
Bechtolsheim's investment was followed by checks from a handful of